What's going on, gamers? I'm Merkaba18. Today I am bringing you my second build guide for Diablo IV Season 5. This one is going to be for the Rogue. The first one is linked in the description below for the Blood Sacrifice Bloodlance Necromancer. We're going to dive into talents, Paragon boards, gears and skills, all of the good stuff. And this is going to be an entry-level sort of gateway into the end game. A lot of the uniques are going to be changed in season 5, and I'm not quite sure. I don't think any of us are quite sure how they're going to work exactly within the Diablo 4 season 5. Obviously, they went a little bit overboard. I would imagine that they are going to have 3 to 5 uniques within this build. But just so that you know, this build is not going to take advantage of those specific uniques. I will talk about some of the ones that I think are going to be useful and ones that you're going to want to kind of plug into the game as you dive deeper into the end game. Now, having tested this build on the PTR, I can tell you Flurry is getting a substantial buff. And I do think we're going to see this become maybe, possibly, people are saying, one of the best builds for AoE damage that Diablo 4 has ever seen. So, bold statement, and we're going to try to back it up. Let's dive right in. And before I do that, I want to make sure everybody hits that subscribe button. We follow on Twitch and TikTok. We live stream this game starting on Tuesday, August 6th. Season 5 will be live. I'll be live streaming across all platforms. So I hope to see you there. Okay, let's dive in. Invigorating Strike is our basic skill, which gives you the 30% damage and increase energy regeneration by 20%. The reason we have chosen Invigorating Strike instead of Puncture here is for 2 reasons that I'll dive deeper into later. But because it's a Cutthroat skill, it's going to gain some bonuses. And because we're going with a Shadow Imbue, it takes better advantage of some of the effects that we're going to need. We are going to grab Enhanced to give us increased damage and regeneration to crowd controlled or injured. And then we want to make sure that we are making people as vulnerable as possible. So we are going to grab Fundamental there. Coming down to our core skills, we are going to grab 5 out of 5 on Flurry, Enhanced Flurry, and then Advanced. This is going to give us increased damage and energy cost reduction, which is huge. This is new. And we're also going to gain a vulnerable application as well and some damage increase there because of Enhanced. In terms of passive, we're going to grab 2 for some movement speed after critical strikes, which should be a lot of the time within this build. Stutter Step is super helpful for movement speed. Damage reduction to close with Sturdy, and then Siphoning Strikes for the heals. We are going to take Shadow Step here, which will give us a damage behind the target, increase movement speed afterwards. Also going to make them vulnerable and apply daze. And then also you gain damage reduction, which is a little bit better, slightly better in my opinion, than the cooldown reduction, which we can get through gear. We are going to grab one of the most unique and meaningful passives in the Rogue Tree, Weapon Mastery. Go ahead and grab 3 out of 3 there. We're going to go 1 out of 3 on Unstable Elixirs to stun when we use a potion. And then Trick-a-Cax is going to gain dazing or stunning an enemy increases your crit strike chance by 6 and your crit strike damage by 6, up to 36% for both. So just a flat crit and damage boost there. For some damage reduction, we're going to go with Dark Shroud, Enhanced to gain some movement speed, and then crit strike chance when you have at least 1 Shadow Dark Shroud up. We're going to grab Exploit for the damage to healthy and injured, which is almost everybody. We're going to gain Malice for 12% increase to damage for vulnerable or knockdown enemies. And then coming down to the imbuement section, we're going to go Shadow Imbuement. This is a Shadow build. So we're going to grab 1 and then go Enhanced for crit strike against injured enemies that are afflicted by Shadow. And then Mixed Shadow Imbuement will give us non-physical damage bonus for 8 seconds. We're going to grab 3 out of 3 for the lucky hit to have a chance to stun, which will then trigger some of the crit strike bonuses we saw a minute ago. And then we are going to generate some energy with Consuming. Just the 1 there, because you don't, especially with Invigorating Strike, you're not going to need that much more. 1 point is enough there. Precision is going to give us crit strike chance with imbued skills. And then we're going to come down to our ult. We have a death trap skill. Place a trap under that explodes for 200% damage, 250% damage each time to each enemy within range. Enemies are going to be pulled in to death trap with prime. And if it kills an enemy, its cooldown is reduced by 12 seconds. So hopefully that's going to re-trigger a lot of death traps. You're going to see a lot of that sort of cycle over onto itself. Aftermath is going to give us heals over time while we have our ultimate on our bar. We're going to gain a little bit of energy regen while moving, which should be every time, all the time. And then we're going to go Victimize for our key passive. Dealing direct damage to a vulnerable enemy has a 50% chance to trigger an explosion. And this bonus is increased by your vulnerable damage bonus. So that's obviously going to be one of the key stats. If you did not know this in Season 5, you are going to, at the base level, prior to Season 5, for every 10 of your max or your base stat, in this case with rogues it's dexterity, you're going to gain 1% damage increase. It is going to go to 9 now. So you get a 10% bonus to your damage based on using dexterity. So dexterity is going to be very important. Cooldown reduction is super important in this build for the ultimate damage and for your imbuements. Attack speed, non-physical damage, crit strike, and crit strike damage are going to be super helpful. Things like overpower are less important. To a lesser degree, physical damage. And then obviously you want some stuff like damage reduction is going to be super helpful into the end game. Okay. Let's talk about some of the gear. Now, as I mentioned, there are a couple of uniques that you're going to want to keep an eye on. There is a new one that plants totems down on the ground and then re-triggers and fires those totems. It's going to work really well within the death trap build, so it's going to basically allow you to have constantly exploding damage. You're going to want that one when it gets up, when it's available, and into the end game. You're definitely going to want to take a look at that one. Things like Shaco are going to be super important, especially with that new cooldown reduction and damage reduction. The new Shaco is going to be best in slot for basically everybody. You're going to want to get the pants that have the potentially have the pants for the death trap re-trigger over and over again on non-bosses. Things like Flicker Step are going to be super helpful within your gloves or boots. But those are the ones that like really come to mind for me in terms of paying attention to. Until you get to that point, these are some of the non-uniques you're going to want to take a look at. Aspect of Might is still one of the best aspects in the entire game. It gives you 20% damage reduction for basic skill usage, which should give you almost 100% uptime, especially with an attack speed flurry build. Explosions from your key passive heal you, so you're going to get some heals just for doing what you do. And then for our gloves, we're going to take a look at imbuement skills have a 40% increased vulnerability potency. Hectic aspect, casting 5 basic skills reduces your cooldowns by 2 seconds, so you get a little bit of cooldown reduction for imbuements and for your cooldowns there. Wild Bolt is going to pull any distant enemies. This is a new one, I think, for this season. It's going to pull enemies that are further away from you into you because you want everything to be close to you so that it's getting hit by Flurry. And as we get into the Paragon board, you're going to do more damage to close. So that is our boots until we get to Flicker Step and some of the unique. Encircling Blades is probably the single most important element of this build. It takes your flurry, and instead of going conal in front of you, it goes 360 all the way around you, and it deals 30% multiplicative damage. You're going to want to put that on your two-handed ranged weapon, usually, or on your dagger, I believe. I think if you get it on the two-handed ranged weapon, it gives you a boost to it, if I'm not mistaken. Either way, you're going to want to make sure that that is getting the highest level of bonus outside of your amulet. You don't want to put that one necessarily on your amulet. Although you could make a case for switching Breakneck, just depending on how your build is set up. So Breakneck is also new. Flurry deals increased damage and has a 20% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds with each hit. Now you're going to be casting Flurry a lot, so you're going to end up with a lot of stunned enemies. If they're stunned, they're not doing damage to you, so that's a no-brainer. You're going to get up to 60% increased damage from Flurry there just by having that on your amulet. So I would recommend putting Breakneck on your amulet and then Aspect on either the weapons. That way you're gaining more damage and more stun, which will also then trigger some other bonuses. Aspect of elements is going to switch back and forth between physical and shadow. So if at all times you're going to basically end up with a 30% increase to your damage. No brainer. Aspect of the expectant is going to give you basic skill or core skill damage based on using a basic skill. So as long as you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're going to end up with a 100% uptime there. Edge Masters is going to give you increased damage based on primary resource. At most of the time, you should be at pretty full, especially with Inner Sight, which is going to be our skill passive. So that's going to give you a flat damage bonus there. And then Aspect of True Sight is going to give us a crit strike damage bonus while we have an enemy that's marked with Inner Sight. So most of the time, you are either going to have killed that Inner Sight target, or you're going to have a crit strike damage bonus to them, which, like, for example, if you're fighting a boss, they'll be marked with Inner Sight, and then you're going to end up doing more damage. You're going to want to put Dexterity and crit strike or vulnerable damage gems on, and then whatever resistances you want on in your rings. All right, now let's get into the Paragon board. There are some major changes to the Paragon board for me this season. Rogue's going to stay about the same. We're going to just try to get some more glyphs than I typically go for. We're going to come up through Prime. We're going to skip the resistances because there's a lot more resistance on gear this season. And then we're going to get closer so that we do more damage with cutthroat skills. This is why we chose Invigorating Strike, by the way, because it takes advantage of that full bonus. All of our skills, our basic and core skills, are going to be cutthroat, so you're going to gain just a flat bonus to the skills you're using most often there. Come up through skillful, and then onto our second board, which is exploit, which is going to give us exploit weakness. The rare legendary node is getting a buff this season, I believe they said. You're going to see, basically, you're going to increase your damage up to 50%. At 50 stacks, this bonus resets and you execute all non-boss enemies nearby. So basically, you're going to end up executing like a bunch of, this is where some of the AoE comes in. You're going to get explosions, and then, anything that's left over is going to end up dying. So it's a free execute on a cooldown, basically. Come up and grab our second glyph, which will be exploit. This is going to trigger vulnerability on everything that isn't already vulnerable through your skills or your talents. And it's going to give you an increase to your vulnerable damage. No brainer there. Then we can come over to our third board, which is Deadly Ambush. Deadly Ambush will give us a crit strike bonus to anybody that's affected by traps. If you're doing it right, Death Trap should be up most of the time. It should have a pretty high uptime. So you're going to end up with a basic, like a crit strike bonus to all of your nearby enemies. We're going to come down and grab some trap skill bonuses here. You can make a case for skipping this if you need to, if you're designing a build that's a little bit different. But I went with it because it's also on the way to our next board. You do want to grab this one, damage to enemies affected by trap skills, and damage reduction by those that are in your. We're going to come down to our fourth board, which is Liriana's Instinct. This legendary node is going to give you 100% dodge chance for 2 seconds after your inner sight gauge is full. And then your core skills are going to deal 25% damage and gain a bonus up to 35%. Huge bonus with inner sight being full there. And then we're going to take damage reduction a little bit there and come down to our next glyph, which is Combat, which will give us a boost to crit strike damage. And skills that critically strike also restore 12% of their energy costs, which means you can cycle Flurry much more often. We're going to gain a little bit of damage bonus after we dodge, which should be a lot of the time, given that we are gaining that pairs nicely with Liriana's right here. We should see a little bit of a 50 to 60% uptime there, so you're going to just gain a little bit of bonus to that dodge. We're going to come over to our next and final board, which is Eldritch Bounty. When you attack with an imbued skill, you gain resistance to that skill and 20% increased damage to that skill. Because it's Shadow and Death Trap is Shadow, it's just a 20% bonus. That's going to have 90 to 100% uptime. Pretty high uptime there. On our way up, we're going to grab non-physical damage. and get our final glyph, which is going to be turf, which will be damage to close, which is why that element that brings all of them into you is going to be so important. Most everything in this game is going to be pretty close to you anyway, but anything that isn't is going to be drawn to you, and then therefore you're going to do more damage to them, and you're going to take less damage from them. We are going to grab a little bit of imbuement skill right here, and then just make sure you're triggering your bonuses. So basically, the gist of this one is you're going to want to try to trigger Death Trap as often as possible. Use those totems through the new unique to trigger further damage. And you're just going to, everything's going to basically explode. And if it doesn't explode, it's going to get executed on a cooldown. And as you can see, with all of the bonuses that you get here, you're going to end up with a ton of extra buffs that you may not have had in the past. So I hope you've enjoyed this build. Stay tuned for the next one, which is going to be our Sork build. That one will go up in a couple of weeks. And I hope to see you on the live streams for Diablo 4 Season 5. Thank you so much for watching.